what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that a lot of stuff kind of seemed to stand still during the pandemic. There's a lot of people felt their life was sort of on hold in some way, but CSS seemed to kick it up a notch, as if trapping all the CSS people in their bedrooms resulted in lots of new things. We've got lots of new stuff landed on the platform. And some of that stuff is things that we thought weren't possible. Even people like myself working on CSS thought weren't ever going to happen. So, how did we get from floats and media queries to subgrid, cascade layers, container queries? And what does that actually mean for the future of the language? What does that mean for us as developers and designers? And what do we need to understand if we're going to benefit from all of this new functionality? So from the beginnings of responsive design in 2009 until flexbox became something that you could just use, floats were pretty much all we had if we wanted to do layout. Now, floating boxes to make something that looks like a grid was unintuitive, but it was pretty simple for everyone to control. You just had to do some math, or you found some framework or whatever that would do the math for you. You'd have a container, you'd nest your boxes inside. Each box had a width in percentages, and the total width of all those boxes added together couldn't be more than 100%. So we got good at that. Designers got good at designing around the limitations of not being able to have one box as tall as one another. And we developed tools and frameworks in order to abstract away the difficulties of doing the math. And the thing is, once you've got a way to do things, very few people will actually look beyond it. This quote is attributed to Henry Ford. He probably didn't say it. If I would have asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. But even if he didn't say it, I think as someone who has developed products over the years and worked on web platform features, I think the sentiment of this quote is very, very true. Because if you ask designers and developers what they wanted to do, which I did many times, it was equal height boxes. It was aligning things, spacing things out evenly. No one was actually asking for an inbuilt grid system for the web or anything fundamentally different from what they already had. They wanted floats plus a few features. But it turned out that the things we wanted weren't actually possible with floats. We can't add in CSS a magic way to floats to make one add space at the bottom to respond to the size of another, because a floated item is taken out of flow. It's independent from everything else on the page. It doesn't know about the floated thing next to it. We try and make it look like it does, and we try and make it look like the things relate to each other by managing their widths carefully, but there's no actual relationship between them. They're individual boxes, they happen to display next to each other. And that was kind of the magic of Flexbox, because in a flex layout, items are treated as a group. And because the items are a group, they can respond to each other. They can align against each other. They can be as tall as the tallest by stretching to the size of the containing element. They can distribute space between them. So in Flexbox, we got the things developers wanted. So this is the Solved by Flexbox project. It was created by one of my colleagues at Google, Philip Walton. He created this in 2013, and it showed how Flexbox had come to fix all of our problems. So at the same time as Flexbox was here to save the world, CSS Grid was also being developed. Now, this was initially by the Microsoft team. The first time we saw anything like Grid, it was in IE10 in 2011. I wrote about it in this post for 24 Ways, and this was in 2012. So by the time that Philip was publishing his Flexbox examples, there was already an implementation being developed by Agalia for Chrome and WebKit. Now, the IE implementation didn't include what I think is one of the best features of Grid, the Grid template areas functionality, that ASCII art representation of your layout in CSS. Now, the interesting thing about that feature is it predates Flex Layout and the Microsoft Grid spec by many years. If we go back as far as 2005, we will find an initial spec for CSS Advanced Layout. This is what eventually became CSS Template Layout. It defined a layout method that will look pretty familiar if you've ever used Grid template areas. So this is the syntax of that early specification. And this is what you do with grid layout today. So rather than the placement happening as a value of display, we have a new property and we're using grid area rather than position. So that early spec, although the roots are there, it didn't have a great solution for how the page was going to be actually laid out. It didn't know how the items could be arranged, how sizing would be resolved, how overlaps and overflow would be dealt with. It essentially tried to build on top of positioning. And if you've ever tried to build an entire layout with positioning, you'll know that doesn't work too well. So the Microsoft Grid Layout spec provided the way to create a grid with lines and tracks. And this idea of templates became a nice way to use the framework that we then created. And so then the promise of template layout for the web became a reality. But would developers actually care about it? That was the question I had when I saw that spec. I knew how powerful it could be and how many use cases it would solve, but I worried it wouldn't actually get any traction. So that was why I started this sort of one-woman mission as the DevRel of CSS Grid. Along the way, more people started to pick up on it, build demos and show what it could do. And I do kind of sort of like to think that my incessant going on about it helped in some small way to push the web forward. So, this quote here is from an Alista Part article about the story of Grid, which is worth a read if you want to know how it all came about and all the different people who were involved. And it's in the notes I'll share at the end of this talk. So during the years of showing people Grid, and even once it actually launched and it was available in all 3 engines, people would say to me, why would I use Grid instead of Flexbox? And has that actually changed today? So I wrote the 2022 CSS chapter of the CSS Almanac. Now that's an annual look at what websites are actually doing with CSS rather than what developers tell us that they're doing with CSS. And I like this because it helps us to get out of our echo chamber, because you can often, if you look on social media, everybody is using something, but that's actually a little bubble of the web and not what's actually happening out there in the world. So I like this kind of actually looking at what people are using. So this chart is from the State of CSS survey. We're asking people if they have used CSS Grid. This was from 2021, and 83.1% of developers have used Grid. That sounds really good. Lots of people are using Grid layout then. But if we look at what's happening on the web, this is Flex and Grid adoption over the past few years. So Grid layout landed in all 3 major engines in March 2017. 2 years later, only 2% of sites were found to be using any Grid at all. In 2021, State of CSS reported 8%. Now, that's not to say that all the developers who said they were using Grid were lying. There's obviously lots of sites out there on the web that were developed before Grid layout or very early on. And also, the State of CSS survey never says, did you use Grid in production? So many developers might have actually learned how to use it, built some demos, but they haven't had the chance to ship something using it yet. But I think a lot of this, and I see this in tweets and people's responses to the question of why aren't you using Grid? It's because Flexbox gave them the faster horses. It gave them the way to line up boxes, have full height boxes, do layouts where things don't overflow. So why bother learning Grid if all the immediate problems have been solved? Now, Grid obviously does a bunch of things that aren't possible with Flexbox, but maybe those use cases aren't compelling enough. Or perhaps there are other things lacking in the platform that means developers, can't take advantage of some of the things. And so I wanted to start looking at some of the other things that are landing at the moment and wonder, what will their adoption story be? And will actually the combination of those features with the bits of Grid that maybe developers aren't really using yet, perhaps those will kind of drive more adoption and drive more people to use that layout method and to move away from Flexbox as being how they actually create a grid. So, container queries. As I spoke about CSS over the years, I would say to web developers, and what would you like to have in the platform? And they would all say en masse, container or element queries. We were always being asked for this. Really, as soon as people could do responsive design, this started. Zach Leatherman did a bit of digging around and found the first mention of container or element queries was in July 2011. Now, Ethan Marcotte's article on responsive web design was published in May 2010. So very quickly, people thought, hey, I'd like to know the size of the container, not just the page. Because obviously testing the viewport size is fine for the major parts of your layout. If you want to know, oh, have I got room for another sidebar? Or should I turn my menu into a hamburger? Those are the sort of things you look at the screen real estate for. But as people moved to designing in components and in pattern libraries and so on, everyone wanted to build these reusable components and just drop them around their layout. So you might have a card like this, the sort of media object, and you want to place it around your design. You want it to go into a sidebar, or you want it to be on the main part of the page. You want the narrow view, not just for narrow viewports, but when it's in a smaller constrained part of the page. And it's that thing that container queries enable. And so to use container queries, the thing that is going to be the container needs to be identified. And you do that with the container type property with a value of inline size. In future, there are coming now other types of containment. But the common use case is this size and really width or inline size containment. And you can also add the container name if you want to name the thing and query something which isn't the first container. But then once you've got your container, you can use container queries really just like you'd use media queries, except you're using container rather than media. And if you want to use the name, which lets you skip that immediate container, you can use the name. So in the example, and so the examples are in the link for this talk, we've got a narrow and a wider wrapper. We make them a container, we drop in the component, and then it reacts to what it's inside. And that's kind of it. And I can understand why people look at that and think, hang on, you told us for years it was impossible to do container queries. It was going to break everyone's browsers. It was going to cause awful performance problems. How come it's now so simple? And here we kind of come back to this fact that as CSS and browsers develop, we unlock things. So just like with that advanced layout or grid template spec, which needed the lines and tracks solution that the Microsoft Grid version gave us, container queries needed something else. One feature enables another. So in the case of container queries, there are actually a couple of suggestions as to how we should do it. The one that stuck was an idea proposed by David Barron, suggesting that the fairly new CSS containment spec could provide some sort of way forward. So the reason we didn't have container queries was that you would need a situation where styles depended on the size of the component, but things inside the component influenced the size. So then we'd kind of get a loop and all sorts of bad things might happen. Size containment, though, tells the browser, I know how big this thing is. If we know how big the thing is, we don't have to keep recalculating it. So this was designed as a performance optimization. If you know that something on your page isn't going to change size, you can tell the browser that, and it won't keep trying to update it when something else on the page changes. So when we got the contain property, we didn't have a way to do single axis size containment at that point. So you couldn't say, I know how wide this thing is, but I don't know how tall it is. So if you add contain size to an element, you're telling the browser you know exactly how big this thing is. And actually on the web, we tend not to. And we might know the width of the inline size, but generally our boxes are big enough to fit the content. We want them to keep expanding as content goes in. So I've got a box here with the border on. It's got a variable amount of text. I've not given it a height. I don't know how big it is. So if I add contain size to the box, it collapses, and that's what that red border is there at the top, because it doesn't actually know about all that content that's extending it. So that's why we needed single axis containment. We needed to be able to say, I know the width or inline size, but not the height or block size. And that was really the beginning of the idea. And this idea Miriam Suzanne built on in her proposal, and that evolved through the CSS working group to be implemented in browsers. We now have inline size containment, and without containment, there could not be container queries. So once again, we've got something that seems very simple to use as a web developer, when you want to use container queries, but it stands on the shoulders of many years of very careful work. So container queries, I started messing around with those, and I started messing around with hot air balloon images because I've got lots, and also playing around with the aspect ratio property, which lets you define an aspect ratio for an element. Now that means you can make perfectly square grid items, which is quite pleasing. So if you put an image in there, use object fit cover, and you can create some pretty nice effects, even if you are a terrible designer like me. So I've made this little demo. Again, it's in the resources. I've got a figure with 3 images and a caption, and I can make the images square using grid and aspect ratio. And then if I've got enough width, I can lay out that figure in a different way. And so I'm using container queries here to decide if I've got enough space for the component to lay out like this. So I think there's some really nice little things you can do there, container queries with grid, with aspect ratio, and we're enabling some nice little effects, but with very little code. So then I was looking at has, which is sometimes referred to as a parent selector. Now what that enables is selecting the parent based on the things that are inside it. Now again, very, very useful for components. It's sometimes useful to do things with CSS when a box contains an image or some other HTML element. Now you'll often see people working around the lack of a parent selector by adding classes to the elements. So you might have a media object and you need to add a class to say it's got a video in it. Or whatever you've got inside, you'll just add different classes and then you can kind of reuse that component. So here's a very simple example. List of items. I only want to get the LI elements if they have an H2. So there's a couple of LI items here that should be selected, the 3rd and the 4th. So I can do that with the selector LI has, then H2 in brackets. So what we're saying here is do something with this selector only if it contains this selector. So that would get any list items with an H2 plus those with an H2 and some other content. And you can use any selector here. So if you only wanted the H2 that's followed by a paragraph, you could use that selector and just get H2s with a paragraph. So again, pretty simple to use. You're just sort of asking whether it contains that thing. Now again, this solves a bunch of problems. So one of the websites I look after, people sometimes post blog posts without a thumbnail image. And that makes me grumpy because the listing looks a mess. Some of the items have images and some do not. Now, obviously, there's lots of ways you can solve that problem technically. But one thing you could do is we could use has and insert an image or a gradient to fill the gap left by the missing images. So in this case, I want to look for the absence of an image. So I'm chaining has with not. If the item does not contain an image, I use generated content to insert some content as the first child of the element, give it the same aspect ratio as the images, and use a gradient. You could also have, a placeholder image or background image with generated content here. Now, I did tell you I'm not a designer. I'm not very good at creating nice gradients, but that's the sort of idea. And I think you can imagine how useful that will be for component-based design. Instead of having to add classes to things to identify them, you can identify what's in the box by just looking in there. Very useful if you're ever in a situation where you don't have full control of the output HTML. If you've got, the CMS generating the content, and you can't actually stop it, not putting something in or what have you. You can have a look in there and then change your CSS depending on what you find. So again, it gets really interesting when we combine these things, because both has and container queries were made for component-based design. By combining them, you have a way to know what's inside the component and how much space the component has to play with. So in this demo, I've got a card component, and that card might contain a few different things. It might contain a figure with a caption. It might contain some text. It might contain the figure and the text. So I want to have different layouts for different content, and also the different content at different breakpoints, so that when I put the card into different places in my layout, it will respond. It will give me a nice layout at each side. Which means that these are the same component. We only get the grid if there is a figure. Again, in my notes of the talk, there's some other examples of this in an article. And then there's Subgrid. Now, obviously, I started this talk really talking about the sort of history of grid layout. And I've been waiting a very, very long time for us to get Subgrid. This is in Safari and Firefox, and it is coming to Chrome. It's actually, if you use Chrome Canary, it's there. Microsoft have been developing that into Chrome. So we will have Subgrid across all the browsers very, very soon. So how does this work, and how might it help us to do sort of interesting things and solve interesting problems? Now, Subgrid, it doesn't involve any new grid properties. It's just a value for grid template columns and grid template rows. So if you give either of those properties a value of Subgrid, and the container is a grid, there's a grid item, the size and number of grid tracks is inherited in that dimension. So here I have a parent grid. I've got 12 columns and 4 rows. The grid item is placed from column line 4 to 8 and row line 2 to 4. So the item is now a grid with 4 column tracks and 2 row tracks lined up with the grid lines of the parent. And if you use DevTools, that's the sort of easiest way to have a look. You can see here I've highlighted the parent grid, and you can sort of see how the tracks all line up. The subgridded item has a border, and you can see how the lines of the subgrid then line up with the parent. And if we highlight the subgrid, you can see that very clearly, how it's all just kind of snapped to the parent grid. And you can see also how I've placed the items there on the grid, the top purple item being part of the outer grid, and the second row one is part of the inner grid. So here I have to place sort of each item separately. But if I name the parent grid lines, those lines, the line names, inherit into the subgrid, which means I can do this. So here I'm naming all of the lines in my grid. I can then give a class of item to both items, and because line E inherits into the subgrid, both are placed at line E, I can address them with a single class. Line E always maps to that line of the parent grid. Now, when we talk about things people don't use a lot with grid, line naming is definitely one of them. Don't see so much of that going on, but I think it becomes incredibly useful once you have subgrid. And it'll be interesting to see if people choose to use it in order to get that sort of lining up right across their grid and down into those nested grids. Now, because the subgrid value essentially replaces the track listing, you can have a subgrid only in one dimension. A common use case might be to define a set of columns on a main wrapper, then inherit those columns into your nested components so that something in your footer can line up with something in the header. But there was initially a proposal to simplify subgrid by locking it to both dimensions. So instead of having separate values of subgrid for grid template columns and grid template rows, there would be a subgrid value of display. If display subgrid was set, then grid template columns and grid template rows would have no effect, and the entire grid would be defined by the parent tracks, which sounds fine until you think that actually, do you always know how many rows your component is going to have? You'd only be able to use subgrid if you knew exactly how many columns and how many rows were required. If you didn't know that, because you couldn't have any implicit grid, you couldn't have extra rows being created, you wouldn't be able to use it for anything that was sort of more dynamic. So as with containment, the need to be able to work in a single axis was really key. We've been waiting a long time for subgrid, but I'm kind of glad that we waited, that we slowed the progress, that we slowed the adoption, and didn't go with that initial model of locking subgrid to both rows and columns. As with so many things in this talk, we often kind of have to wait for the features and functionality that we want. I think the waiting is worthwhile if it results in a more elegant, useful, or performant solution. Because once things get into the web platform, we can't take them back. It's very hard to roll back web platform features. They're kind of there forever. So I think Subgrid is going to be really useful, again, in combination with container queries. You need a browser, obviously, that supports both features to be able to play around with this. Because you'll be able to create subgrids or use the tracks of a subgrid based on available space. So here's a super simple example. So once this component has enough width, I turn it into a grid layout with columns defined by the parent. So with less space, you can see the tracks of the parent there are running through the component, but it's not using them. It's just spanning over them. When we have enough space, the component uses the parent grid tracks. Now, I think there's a load of use cases for this, particularly if you think of components that have got a lot of internal structure, form components, for example. Using subgrid and container queries will allow things to nicely line up with grids up the tree while keeping the elements of your form that you need to provide semantics and structure. So all this is to say there are so many possibilities with these new CSS features, and each new thing can be combined with existing things, making the language more useful and capable. Everything we add becomes a multiplier because it can be added to these other things and start to make them even more useful. But it does also bring a bunch of complexity, new things to learn. Now, you might have managed to avoid learning a huge amount about selectors, for example. If you're using a framework or a methodology that works by adding a bunch of classes to things, you might just kind of be able to sidestep a lot of the more in-depth selector use. But if you want to really take advantage of has, you need to understand how selectors work. And there's a bunch of subtleties in how these things work. When I was talking about container queries, I mentioned that it kind of hangs on containment. So if you make something a container with container type, that acts as if you've applied contain inline size. And if you use containment, certain things happen. In particular, the same things happen that happen when you create a new block formatting context. So if your container, for example, is a flex or grid container, there won't be any change because switching to grid or flex already creates a new formatting context. But if you're not using grid or flex, when you create a new formatting context or add containment on a box that's in normal flow, it will do things like it will cause floats and margins to be contained. So that means if you have a floated item inside the container, it will be fully contained. It won't poke out the bottom. Margins also won't collapse through the container. And maybe something like that is something you're very rarely going to encounter. But one day you're going to run into it and it's going to seem completely baffling unless you understand what applying containment actually means. And I do wonder when I talk to people, and I kind of hear this, how much this sort of perceived complexity slows down adoption. By using flexbox for grid layouts, developers actually removed a lot of the complexity because they were reducing flex layout to floats plus. And in comparison, grid with all these properties look pretty overwhelming. So I think it's going to be interesting over the next year or so to see what the adoption curve for container queries looks like, because there isn't a good way to do anything like container queries. Grid and flex layouts removed some of the need for container queries because of the way that they lay out content, but there's lots and lots of patterns that just aren't possible. And I think the fact that container queries is understandable by anyone who's ever used a media query, that helps it not add to the overwhelm. And so to the future. I'm often asked what the next big thing will be. Mind, there seems to be a new big thing showing up all the time. It's pretty exciting. There's various things in CSS I'm very keen to see. I've spoken before about my hopes for something like regions. However, before we introduce more new layout, I think we should probably hold back and solve another problem and make sure that in our drive to improve developer experience, to improve our productivity and the ability to create better visual layouts, we don't leave anyone behind, because there is a problem in new layout. it's become incredibly easy to completely disconnect the underlying HTML document from the visual display and the sort of reading order. This happens if you use the order property in Flexbox and Grid, if you use row or column reverse in Flex Layout, if you use any positioning or by lines or grid template areas, you have the possibility to do this. And this is kind of what I mean. As a sort of very simple example, I've got a UL, list items being laid out by grid. I'm using grid template areas to position the items as if I really don't care about what the underlying markup looks like. And then if I tab through the items, the focus starts to jump about. So this is a problem. If you've got a long page or a complex app, a person navigating using the keyboard can easily find themselves hopping all over the place, completely out of sync with what appears a logical order if you're just looking at the layout and using a mouse perhaps to move around. So this comes up, people ask about it, and developers are told to create a good semantic source document, which is obviously a good idea anyway, and then not deviate from it. Now, on surface, this seems like solid advice, and for a lot of layouts, it's absolutely fine. But we do have times when the optimal layout on a phone or at other narrow viewports is different to the optimal layout on a large desktop. And with Grid, we've got the ability to create different layouts at different breakpoints very easily. But if we do, some users are going to encounter a poor experience. Several people have said to me, it feels like we've been given a cool thing and then told not to use it. So I saw the possibilities of being able to reorder things and at the time, not the problems when I wrote that 24 Ways article in 2012. I gave it the title Giving Content Priority because at the time I was thinking, oh, we'll be able to use Grid to reorder content at different breakpoints, give the optimal experience at each. I was thinking as a person who's worked for a long time with content management. And with container queries now a thing, with the ability to make these flexible, reusable components, they may exist in a pattern library, separate from the layout and then used all over the place. I think, we build on more problems, more places where we may well develop this poor experience for people by not thinking about how the navigation order is going to work throughout the entire document and having no way to control it. So I've been thinking about this for a while. I've been talking to a lot of people about it, and I eventually proposed a solution, which was essentially to allow developers to opt a component into this layout or visual order. It would be a very rare thing indeed for a proposal to survive the working group scrutiny unscathed, and especially a proposal like this, which needs input from accessibility communities. I'm not an accessibility expert. I'm a developer who cares about it. So this was discussed and refined by the CSS working group. This issue has tons of people commenting on it, which is wonderful. And a better version of that initial idea was created. It's still, something that's being worked on, but the idea is to add a reading order property for the children, with reading order items applied to the container to explain our intention as the ideal reading order. I've recently written a blog post on developer.chrome.com explaining how it is going to work if this is what we go with. But very briefly, for items that are positioned on Grid, you might do something like this. Set that you're using Grid and the flow is by rows, using reading order items, then give the children a reading order value of auto to indicate that the reading order rather than the source order should be followed. Because the thing is, if we can crack this problem, that's going to enable things with Grid that really aren't possible with any other layout method. Being able to reorder content from CSS based on things we can identify using CSS, could be really useful. But focus is, as I say, very hard. And one of my reasons for writing the post on developer.chrome.com is to gather feedback and to gather some of the use cases that people have for this kind of reordering to make sure that whatever we do is actually going to work well for people who want to do reordering and also the people using, assistive technology or just keyboard navigating, which I do a lot, making sure that we're not creating a bad experience. And I think the intersections between layout methods are where an awful lot of possibilities lie, but also where other, bugs, particularly accessibility issues, might be lurking to trip us up. And I think as you're combining things, you may well be one of the first people who encounters some of the problems. So, do raise things up, raise them up with the CSS working group, raise them up with browsers when you find these things, because, it's quite often that, we see a developer just trying something out and then going, hang on, that seems odd. And it's great if we can get that kind of feedback. And do look at these new features as they come through and see what they can solve in combination. We're getting stuff into browsers so much more quickly at the moment. Things are becoming interoperable so much more quickly. And if you can just put what was possible to one side and consider there might be new things to take advantage of, I think you'll find some really surprising and useful things at the intersections between these methods. So thank you very much. You'll find all sorts of things at that URL and these slides. And yeah, thank you for listening.